Han Siren didn't scream. She didn't reach for the emergency phone or try to run. She simply stood there, staring at the shifting numbers of the elevator display, and folded her thumb into her palm, tucking 4 fingers over it in a tight, rhythmic squeeze. It was a silent plea for mercy, hidden against the seam of her blue delivery uniform. And the moment the man in the corner saw that signal, the air in the small steel box turned lethal. He moved so quietly not even the predator behind her noticed the shadow shifting. But what happened when those elevator doors finally opened? That's where the real nightmare began. If you're feeling the tension and want to see how this ends, go ahead and subscribe. Drop a comment below with "save" if you've ever felt like someone was following you. It's a dark world out there, but sometimes the person you're most afraid of is the only one who can save you. Stick around because tomorrow's story is even more intense. Now back to the elevator. It happened in the lobby of the Sterling Heights luxury high-rise, all polished marble and cold glass. Han Siren was just trying to finish her last shift, clutching a thermal bag that felt like a shield against the man who had followed her from the parking lot. Silas Cade stood inches behind her, his gray hoodie pulled low, smelling of stale rain and obsession. He was too close, his breathing heavy against the back of her neck, waiting for the doors to open on a quiet, residential floor. No one in the building noticed the girl's trembling hands. No one cared about the service worker in the blue and white cap. No one except the man who stepped in at the last second. Elio Montclair didn't look like a hero. In his sharp black Italian suit, with eyes like flint and a reputation for burying his problems in the city's foundations, he was the most feared mafia boss in the state. He stood in the opposite corner, seemingly focused on the gold cufflinks at his wrists. But as the elevator began its ascent, Elio caught a glimpse of the brass wall's reflection. He saw the girl's subtle gesture. He saw the predator's hand creeping toward her waist. In that single second, Elio's cold, dangerous realization set in. He wasn't just sharing a lift with a delivery girl and a customer. He was witnessing a hunt. And Elio Montclair didn't like competitors on his home turf. The heavy steel doors of the Sterling Heights elevator slid shut with a final, metallic thud, sealing the 3 of them into a space no larger than a confession booth. As the lift began its smooth, pressurized ascent, the silence inside became a living thing, thick, suffocating, and charged with an electric sense of dread. In the front corner, Han Siren stared straight ahead at the polished doors. Her reflection was a ghost in the brass, a young woman in a faded blue and white delivery uniform clutching a thermal bag as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. To any casual observer, she was just another worker tired at the end of a long shift. But Elio Montclair wasn't a casual observer. He was a man whose life depended on reading the minute shifts in a room's temperature, and right now the air around Siren was ice cold. Directly behind her, Silas Cade loomed. He didn't stand, he hovered. His gray hoodie was pulled forward, casting a deep shadow over eyes that never left the back of Siren's neck. He stood far closer than social grace allowed, his chest almost brushing her shoulder. Every time the elevator swayed, he leaned in, an intentional, predatory tilt that made the girl's breath hitch in her throat. He looked like a man who had practiced this, a man who thrived in the anonymity of crowded cities and closed doors. Elio stood in the back corner, the apex predator in a 3-piece suit. He looked perfectly composed, his large, scarred hands resting casually at his sides. To Silas, Elio was just another wealthy tenant, a high-rise ghost who wouldn't look twice at a delivery girl. But Elio was watching. He noticed the way Siren's heels were dug into the floor, ready to bolt. He noticed the way the man in the hoodie kept his right hand buried in his pocket, gripped around something heavy. Then it happened. Siren's right hand, hidden from Silas by the angle of her body but perfectly visible to Elio in the brass reflection, moved. Slowly, with agonizing precision, she tucked her thumb into her palm. Her 4 fingers folded over it, squeezing tight. Then she released and did it again. It was a silent scream for help, a code taught to the vulnerable for the moments when words would only invite violence. Elio felt a familiar, cold fire ignite behind his ribs. He spent his days dealing with kings and killers, men who fought for territory and power. But there was something about the sight of this girl, trapped in a steel box with a coward who thought he was a hunter, that offended his sense of order. In his world there were wolves and there were sheep, but men like Silas were something else entirely. They were vermin. The floor indicator flickered. 7? Siren's breathing was coming in shallow, jagged bursts now. She knew her floor was coming. She knew that when those doors opened, she would have to step out into a quiet, carpeted hallway, and Silas would be right there behind her. Elio shifted his weight. It was a small movement, the mere creak of expensive leather shoes, but in the silence of the elevator, it sounded like a gavel hitting a block. His eyes locked onto the back of Silas's head, measuring the distance, calculating the force. The hunt was about to change. The doors were going to open soon, but Silas Cade was starting to realize that he wasn't the only one in the elevator who had been watching. The floor indicator light for the 10th floor blinked with a dull, rhythmic chime that felt like a countdown. Within the confined space, the air grew heavier, thick with the scent of Silas Cade's damp hoodie and the metallic tang of the elevator's inner workings. Elio Montclair remained perfectly still, his gaze fixed seemingly on the space between the doors, but his focus was entirely elsewhere. He was watching the reflection in the polished brass panels, a distorted, golden-hued mirror that revealed the truth behind the silence. In the brass, Elio saw the girl's knuckles. They were white, her grip on the thermal bag so tight that her small frame was trembling with a high-frequency vibration only a man like him would notice. Behind her, Silas's reflection was a dark, smeared shape, but his eyes were clear. They were darting from the girl's neck to the floor display, a predator calculating the distance to his den. Elio watched as Silas leaned in, his lips inches from Siren's ear, whispering something so low it didn't even register as a sound, only a puff of breath that made the girl flinch as if she had been struck. That flinch was all the confirmation Elio needed. His mind, a cold machine built for strategy and survival, began to decode the scene with clinical precision. He didn't see a delivery girl, he saw a target. He didn't see a man in a hoodie, he saw a glitch in the order of his city. Elio's eyes tracked back to Siren's hand. She was still making the signal, thumb tucked, for fingers folding, a rhythmic pulse of desperation. It was a cry for help designed to be invisible to the world, yet to Elio, it was as loud as a siren. He recognized the fear because he dealt in it. He knew the difference between the fear of a man losing money and the soul-crushing terror of a person who realized they were no longer in control of their own fate. Siren wasn't just afraid, she was mourning her own safety, her eyes glazed with the realization that the next 30 seconds might be the last moments of her life as she knew it. Elio's hand moved subtly, his thumb brushing against the heavy signet ring on his pinky finger. It was a subconscious habit, a precursor to violence. He had spent years hardening his heart, telling himself that the struggles of the common world were beneath him. He was a man of shadows and high-stakes war. But as he watched the girl's reflected eyes well up with a single unshed tear, a dormant sense of protective rage flickered to life. The elevator groaned as it passed the 11th floor. The transition was coming. Silas reached out, his hand finally leaving his pocket to hover just an inch above Siren's lower back, his fingers twitching in anticipation. He was already claiming her. In his mind, the girl was already his. Elio's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened, the flinty gray turning to a bottomless black. He didn't just see the fear anymore. He understood its source. Silas wasn't a professional. He was a thrill seeker, a bottom feeder who thought the quiet hallways of the Sterling Heights offered him a sanctuary for his crimes. He had no idea that he was currently trapped in a 4x4 steel box with the one man who turned nightmares into reality for people like him. The chime for the 12th floor rang out, a sharp, final note. The doors began to groan, ready to part, but Elio's hand was already moving toward the control panel. The game was over. The 12th floor chime cut through the silence like a guillotine blade. As the elevator slowed, the heavy brass doors parted with agonizing deliberation, revealing the plush, deserted carpet of the residential hallway. This was it, the moment Silas had been waiting for, and the moment Siren had been dreading. The second the gap was wide enough, Silas's demeanor shifted from simmering threat to overt aggression. He didn't wait for Siren to move. He lunged, his hand snaking out from his hoodie to wrap firmly around her upper arm. The force of his grip was violent, jerking the girl toward the opening. Siren's breath left her in a sharp, broken gasp as her thermal bag tumbled from her hands, hitting the floor with a hollow thud that echoed through the hallway. "Come on, babe," Silas hissed, his voice no longer a whisper but a jagged, desperate command. "We're late." He tried to drag her out, his boots catching on the threshold. Siren dug her heels into the elevator floor, her eyes wide and fixed on the brass reflection of the man she hoped was still standing behind them. She didn't scream, she couldn't, but her gaze was a frantic, wordless prayer. For a heartbeat, Silas thought he had succeeded. He had the girl, he had the floor, and the hallway was empty. But then the elevator doors stopped closing. They didn't just stop, they shuddered as a massive, manicured hand slammed against the sensor, forcing the heavy metal panels back into their pockets with a violent hiss. Silas spun around, his face contorting into a mask of indignant rage. "Mind your own business, pal. We're just having a—" His voice died in his throat. Elio Montclair hadn't just stopped the door. He had stepped forward, filling the exit with his sheer physical presence. The warm, expensive lighting of the hallway hit the sharp planes of Elio's face, casting his eyes into deep, impenetrable shadow. He looked less like a man and more like a force of nature, an ancient, vengeful deity carved from granite and dressed in silk. "The girl stays," Elio said. His voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a terrifying, resonant depth that seemed to vibrate the very floorboards beneath their feet. Silas tightened his grip on Siren, a fatal mistake born of panic. "Who do you think you are? This is my girlfriend. Get back or I'll—" "You'll what?" Elio interrupted, taking a single, predatory step into the hallway. The air seemed to vanish from the corridor. Silas felt the sudden, crushing weight of a man who had ended wars with a phone call and buried enemies with a nod. Elio's gaze dropped to Silas's hand, which was still bruising Siren's arm. "You have 3 seconds to remove your hand before I remove it for you. And I don't use a doctor." The struggle hung in a delicate, lethal balance. Siren stood frozen between the two men, one a sniveling coward who hunted in the dark, and the other a monster of the light who had decided for the first time in a long time to hunt back. The point of no return had been crossed. The elevator was empty, the hallway was a stage, and Silas Cade was about to realize that he had accidentally invited the devil to dinner. Elio didn't move with the frantic energy of a man in a hurry. He moved with the terrifying, inevitable grace of a mountain beginning to slide. As Silas's grip tightened on Siren's arm, Elio took a single step out of the elevator and into the hallway, his presence effectively swallowing the light. The air in the corridor seemed to turn to lead, thick and impossible to breathe for the man who had, moments ago, thought himself the most dangerous person on the floor. Silas's face paled, the indignant rage he had mustered withering under the weight of Elio's stare. He looked at Elio's hands, large, steady and capable of terrible things, and then back to the sharp, predatory lines of Elio's suit. He realized too late that he hadn't just encountered a witness. He had stumbled into the path of an apex predator. "I told you," Elio said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, lethal register that made the hair on Siren's neck stand up. 3 seconds. You've used 2. Silas let out a panicked, high-pitched laugh, his fingers twitching against Siren's skin. "You're crazy. I'm calling the cops. You can't just—" In a blur of motion that Siren's eyes could barely track, Elio reached out. He didn't punch, he didn't swing. He simply caught Silas's wrist in a grip that sounded like dry wood snapping. Silas let out a strangled shriek, his knees buckling as he was forced to release Siren. The girl stumbled back, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she retreated toward the safety of the elevator's open doors. Elio didn't let go. He leaned in close, his face inches from Silas's, his eyes as cold and empty as a winter grave. "You like the dark, don't you, Silas? You like following people into small spaces where they can't scream. You like the feeling of someone else's pulse racing because of you." Elio's hand tightened, and Silas let out a whimpering sound, the bravado of the stalker completely extinguished. The apex predator hadn't just stopped the elevator. He had stopped Silas's entire world. Elio wasn't just defending a girl. He was dismantling a monster layer by layer with a clinical, terrifying efficiency. "But here's the thing about small spaces," Elio whispered, his breath ghosting over Silas's trembling features. "They don't just trap the prey. They trap the hunter too. And right now, Silas, you are the only prey in this hallway." Siren watched from the threshold, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had spent the last 20 minutes feeling like a ghost, a victim waiting for a tragedy to happen. But as she looked at Elio, standing tall, terrifying and strangely protective, she realized the tragedy wasn't going to be hers. The shift was absolute. The man in the hoodie was no longer a threat. He was a broken thing caught in the jaws of something far older and far more dangerous. Elio turned his head just a fraction, his gaze catching Siren's for a fleeting second. In that look there was no warmth but there was a promise. "You are safe. He is mine." Silas's knees hit the carpeted floor of the hallway with a heavy thud, but even as his body cowered, his mind scrambled for a way to manipulate the situation. He looked up at Elio, his breath coming in shallow, jagged wheezes, and tried to force a pathetic, trembling smile. The predator was trapped, yet he still reached for the mask of a victim. You don't understand, man," Silas stammered, his voice cracking with a manufactured desperation. He reached out a shaking hand toward Siren, who flinched and retreated deeper into the elevator's light. This is Siren. We're together. We just had a fight. She's upset because I forgot our anniversary. Right, babe? Tell him. Tell him everything's fine. Elio didn't move. He didn't even blink. He looked down at Silas with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a dying insect. The boyfriend card was a classic move for lowlives, a desperate attempt to turn a public abduction into a private domestic dispute, banking on the idea that strangers wouldn't want to get involved in someone else's relationship. But Elio Montclair was not a stranger to lies. He had built an empire on them, and he could smell the stench of this one from across the corridor. Is that so? Elio asked, his voice a low, vibrating hum that seemed to rattle Silas's teeth. He turned his head slightly toward Siren. He didn't ask her if it was true. He didn't need to. He simply watched her reaction. Siren's face was a mask of horror. I don't even know his name, she whispered, her voice barely audible but cutting through Silas's fabrications like a blade. He's been following my van for 3 blocks. He followed me into the lobby. I've never seen him before today. Elio's gaze snapped back to Silas, and the temperature in the hallway seemed to drop another 10 degrees. The small, pathetic lie had evaporated, leaving Silas standing naked in his own guilt. You're a bad actor, Silas, Elio said, stepping closer until the toe of his handmade Italian loafer was touching Silas's trembling thigh. The boyfriend card only works when the girl isn't terrified for her life. And it definitely doesn't work when you've been caught on high-definition cameras in the lobby, stalking a delivery worker like a common cur. Silas began to babble, the words tumbling out in a frantic, incoherent stream. No, she's lying. She's just mad. I live here. I have a right to be here. Elio reached down and grabbed the collar of Silas's hoodie, hauling him up until they were eye to eye. The sheer strength in Elio's arm was effortless, a terrifying display of controlled power. Silas's feet dangled inches off the floor, his face turning a mottled shade of purple. You don't live here, Elio whispered, his words sharp enough to draw blood. I own this floor. I know every face that belongs in this building. And yours? Yours is a shadow that's about to be erased. The shadow was unmasked. Silas Cade wasn't a boyfriend, wasn't a tenant, and wasn't a man. He was a mistake that Elio was currently deciding how to fix. The hallway, once a place of luxury and silence, had become a chamber of judgment. Elio tightened his grip on the hoodie, his eyes locking onto Silas's with a finality that made the man's bladder fail. The game of pretend was over, and the real interrogation was about to begin. Elio didn't let him fall back to the floor. Instead, he shoved Silas against the cold, designer wallpaper of the hallway, the man's feet dangling uselessly beneath him. The silence of the 12th floor was absolute, broken only by the ragged, wet sounds of Silas's breathing and the distant hum of the building's ventilation. Siren stood frozen by the elevator, her eyes wide as she watched the man who had been her nightmare transform into a terrified plaything. You have a very recognizable habit, Silas, Elio said, his voice dropping to a low, conversational tone that was far more frightening than a shout. He leaned in, his face a mask of granite-hard indifference. You like to park that rusted-out silver sedan 2 blocks away from the distribution hub, don't you? You think the distance makes you invisible. But my people manage the security for that entire district. Silas's eyes bulged, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. The boyfriend lie was dead, buried under the weight of cold, hard facts. 3 days, Elio continued, his grip tightening on the hoodie until Silas's face began to flush purple. Tuesday you followed her to the West End. You sat in your car for 40 minutes while she made her rounds, watching her through binoculars. Wednesday you got bolder. You followed her into the deli on 5th, standing just 2 people behind her in line, breathing in the scent of her hair while she bought her lunch. And today you thought you'd finally bring the hunt home. Silas tried to speak, but the words were caught in his throat. He realized then that he wasn't just being confronted by a passerby. He was being interrogated by a man who already had the dossier on his life. Elio hadn't just noticed the signal in the elevator. He had been aware of the glitch in the neighborhood for 72 hours. In Elio's world, a predator stalking on his turf wasn't just a crime, it was a personal insult. I know about the basement apartment on Crowley Street, Elio whispered, his lips inches from Silas's ear. I know about the folders on your hard drive labeled with the routes of 3 other girls. You think you're a ghost, Silas? You're just a stain. And I've spent my entire life cleaning up stains. The realization hit Silas like a physical blow. This wasn't a hero saving a girl. This was an apex predator cleaning his territory. The man holding him knew his name, his car, his habits, and his darkest secrets. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had been obliterated. Silas looked toward Siren, hoping for a shred of pity, but he found none. She was no longer looking at him with fear. She was looking at him with the cold realization of just how long she had been hunted. Elio's eyes tracked back to the girl for a split second, ensuring she was still safe, before refocusing on the trembling wreck in his hand. The police see a stalker and they see paperwork, Elio said, his voice as sharp as a razor. I see a stalker and I see a pest that needs to be removed from the ecosystem. Now, Silas, you're going to tell me exactly what you plan to do once those doors close behind her, or I'm going to make sure you never walk into another building again. Elio's grip didn't loosen, but the explosive violence of the moment subsided into a terrifying, crystalline calm. He let Silas's feet touch the carpet, but kept him pinned against the wall with a single hand pressed against his chest. The silence in the hallway was so absolute that the distant sound of the elevator's cooling fan sounded like a roar. Siren remained by the doors, her hands still shaking, watching as the man who had been her hunter was dismantled by a man who looked like he was deciding where to discard a piece of trash. You like to play with time, don't you, Silas? Elio asked, his voice a smooth, low-frequency hum. You like the minutes spent waiting in the dark. You like the seconds of panic before you strike. So let's play your favorite game. I'm going to give you 10 seconds. Silas let out a jagged, pathetic sob. 10 seconds for what? Please, I'll leave. I'll never come back here, I swear. Back here, I swear. 10 seconds to find a god and pray to him, Elio whispered, his eyes narrowing into cold slits of obsidian. Because at the end of those 10 seconds, your life as you know it is over. You can choose how this ends. You can choose to walk out of here in handcuffs and spend the next 20 years looking over your shoulder, or I can take you down to the basement right now and ensure you never look at anything ever again. Elio's thumb began to move, a slow, rhythmic tap against Silas's sternum. 1. Silas began to hyperventilate, his eyes darting frantically toward the stairs, then back to Elio's immovable face. He looked for a flicker of mercy, a sign of hesitation, anything. He found only the dead-eyed stare of a man who had long ago traded his soul for an empire. 2. 3. Wait. I'll confess. I'll tell the cops everything. Just don't let him take me. Silas shrieked, his gaze swinging toward Siren as if she could save him. But Siren didn't move. She stood tall, her chin lifting as she watched the man who had made her feel like prey finally face a predator he couldn't outrun. 4. 5. Elio leaned in closer, his shadow completely enveloping the smaller man. Think carefully, Silas. The police are slow. The law is flexible. But my reach is eternal. If I let you go to them and I ever see your shadow on a delivery route again, there won't be a 10-second warning next time. 6. 7. The weight of the choice was crushing Silas's spirit. To turn himself in was to face the system he had spent years evading. To stay with Elio was to face something far worse. He realized that Elio wasn't just offering a choice, he was offering a final mercy. 8. 9. Elio's hand shifted from Silas's chest to his throat, the pressure increasing just enough to make the point. The apex predator was finished playing. The time for games had passed. 10. Silas collapsed, his legs finally giving out as he slid down the wall in a heap of gray polyester and broken pride. Call them, he choked out, his head hanging low. Call the police. Just get me away from him. Elio looked down at the shivering wreck at his feet and felt a cold sense of satisfaction. He turned his head toward Siren, the hardness in his gaze softening by a fraction of a percent. The choice was made. The vermin had chosen the cage over the grave. The predator was broken, reduced to a weeping heap of discarded ego against the hallway wall, but Elio knew that the physical threat was only half the battle. He turned away from Silas with a look of profound disgust, his focus shifting entirely to the young woman still standing in the threshold of the elevator. Han Siren looked like a statue carved from ice, pale, rigid, and perched on the edge of a total collapse. It's over, Elio said. He kept his distance, his voice losing the jagged edge of the interrogator and softening into a low, grounding baritone. He didn't reach for her. He knew that to a woman who had spent the last hour being hunted, any sudden movement was a threat. He isn't going anywhere. You're safe now. Siren's eyes, wide and glassy, slowly tracked from the crumpled form of Silas back to Elio. A shiver finally broke through her paralysis, starting at her shoulders and racking her entire frame. She looked down at her empty hands, only then realizing she had dropped the thermal bag. Elio followed her gaze, stepped over to the discarded bag, and picked it up with the same care he might use to handle a delicate piece of evidence. He set it on a nearby marble console table, a small gesture of dignity in a situation that had stripped her of so much. "Take a breath," he commanded gently. "In for 4, out for 4. Do it with me." He stood there, a man who had ordered executions and commanded the city's underworld, patiently counting out breaths for a delivery girl in a quiet hallway. As Siren's breathing began to level out, the frantic, bird-like thrumming in her chest slowed. She looked at him, really looked at him, noticing for the first time that while he was terrifying, his presence was like a high wall between her and the darkness. "Why?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Why did you help me?" Elio smoothed the front of his suit jacket, his expression unreadable. "Because you asked," he replied simply. "And in this building, nobody ignores a call for help. Especially not from someone who has the courage to stay silent while they fight." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a slim, black smartphone, tapping a series of keys. "I've called my private security team. They're coming up now. They'll wait with you until the police arrive, and they'll make sure the report is written correctly. No domestic dispute, lies, no misunderstandings. Just the truth." He looked at her bruised arm, the red marks from Silas's grip beginning to darken. A flicker of that old, cold rage touched his eyes, but he suppressed it for her sake. "I own a medical clinic 3 blocks from here. After the police are done, my driver will take you there. You'll be looked after." "And Siren?" She looked up, meeting the gaze of the man who had decamped from his shadow empire to save her. "You don't have to look over your shoulder anymore," Elio promised, his voice as solid as iron. "I know his face. I know his car. And by tomorrow morning, every person on my payroll will know them too. He will never get within a mile of you again. That is a Montclair guarantee." For the first time since she had entered the elevator, Siren let out a long, shaky exhale that wasn't born of fear. She wasn't just safe, she was protected by the only man in the city who could truly make the shadows retreat. In the distance, the chime of the elevator signaled the arrival of Elio's men, and for Hans Siren, the long walk through the dark was finally over. The sirens remained a distant hum as Elio's private security detail arrived, 2 silent, imposing men who moved with a clinical efficiency that mirrored their employers. Without a word, they took positions flanking the shivering Silas, who looked up at them with the hollow eyes of a man who realized his world had shrunk to the size of a prison cell. Elio didn't spare him another glance. He stepped back into the shadows of the hallway and pulled a second, encrypted phone from his inner pocket. The call was picked up on the first ring. "Detective Miller," a gravelly voice answered. "I have a gift for you on the 12th floor of the Sterling Heights," Elio said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "His name is Silas Cade. He's been stalking a delivery worker for 3 days. You'll find a silver sedan parked 2 blocks from the hub. It'll have everything you need to link him to the Crowley Street cases." There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. Miller knew better than to ask how Elio had the information. "And the girl?" "She is under my protection," Elio replied, his eyes drifting to Siren, who was now being draped in a warm wool coat by one of his men. "Ensure the responding officers are professional. If this report is buried or if he's back on the street by morning, I'll consider it a breach of our understanding. Do I make myself clear?" "Crystal," Miller grunted. "The units are 2 minutes out." Elio ended the call and tucked the phone away. The elevator dinged again, and this time the blue and red flicker of police lights began to dance against the hallway windows from the street below. The transition from the lawless justice of the underworld to the formal procedure of the city was beginning, but the power in the room still centered entirely on the man in the Italian suit. He walked over to Siren one last time. She looked smaller in the oversized coat, her face still pale, but the soul-deep terror in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet, exhausted relief. She reached out, her fingers brushing the sleeve of his jacket. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "Most people wouldn't have even looked at my hand." "Then most people are blind," Elio said. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a heavy, black embossed card with nothing but a single phone number on it. He pressed it into her palm. "If anyone ever follows you again, if you ever feel that shadow behind you, you call this number. You don't need a signal. Just the name Montclair." As the police burst through the stairwell doors, Elio began to retreat. He was a man who lived in the margins and his work here was finished. He watched for a moment as the officers swarmed Silas, the handcuffs clicking shut with a finality that echoed through the corridor. He saw Siren sit down on the console table, finally safe, finally seen. Elio stepped back into the elevator, the brass doors reflecting a man who had briefly traded his crown of thorns for a shield. As the lift descended toward the garage, he felt the familiar coldness of his world returning, but the memory of those 4 fingers folding over a thumb remained burned into his mind. He had saved her life, but in the silence of the descent, Elio wondered if the girl in the blue uniform had done something far more difficult. She had reminded a monster what it felt like to be human.